Roses Red, Part 5. We walked down into the village as a crisp breeze stirred fallen leaves into pirouettes on the streets. We arrived a few minutes before things were due to begin, but there were still empty seats on the front row. Dr. Fineworth was at the podium shifting through his notes, but stopped and smiled as he spotted me. He crossed the short stage and I introduced Dunstan to him. "Think you'll get a full house?" Dunstan asked. Dr. Fineworth grinned. "I'm surprised this many showed up. I hope I make it worthwhile. There's a TV show on the Windsors they're missing for this." The doctor laughed and I was struck by his movie star looks, like a brown-skinned Rock Hudson. We sat and I estimated that there were about 50 or 60 people present. It was an excellent turnout by Cumberbatch standards. I caught some curious eyes staring at Dunstan and I, but I ignored them. Dr. Fineworth began his lecture with a slideshow, showing some old black and white photos of groups of British soldiers. The dour-looking young men stared at us from across the ages. World War I ghosts. You may be surprised to know that over 70,000 Indian soldiers also fought in the war under the British Raj, Dr. Fineworth continued. They fought against the Germans on a number of fronts, including the Middle East, Egypt, and North Africa. I heard a brief murmur of surprised whispers behind me. I was also being educated. Dr. Fineworth waited until the murmur died down. The next shot was of a group of Indian nurses tending to injured soldiers in a tent. Dr. Fineworth explained that Indian women also served during the war as nurses, drivers, and in other capacities. "You're probably wondering, what does the Indian presence in World War II have to do with my topic?" Dr. Fineworth asked. "It has everything to do with this." He turned and dramatically gestured to the screen. The next shot was of a pair of diamond and dark blue stone earrings. They were stunning and ornately decorated in gold settings. The stones were massive, and I felt the owner must have had some pretty strong earlobes to bear them. "The Tears of the Shah, precious treasure from a pre-colonial era, when Indian royalty enjoyed absolute power. In 1913, they were on exhibition in a museum in Libya, due to a special arrangement with the wealthy Indian family who owned them." The next photo showed two single photos obviously taken in different places, of a young British soldier and an Indian nurse. I noted how beautiful she was, even in the faded photo. The young man looked vaguely familiar, but then again, all the faces in the black and white photos seemed to have similar features. I zoned out for a few minutes trying to place them. Perhaps they were movie stars of that time? So this couple planned and pulled off the theft so successfully in 1914, these priceless earrings were never found. Of course, what people found most shocking was not the theft of the century, but the interracial romance. He said it in a tone that prompted chuckles. Dr. Fineworth continued to explain that the theft was an analogy for the way the British had divested its colonies of native resources, though, but not always, as clear-cut as the Tears of the Shah robbery. Dunstan touched my elbow and I automatically checked my watch. Over an hour had passed already. I nodded and we got up and tried to leave surreptitiously. Fortunately, the room was still in darkness as the slideshow continued. As we stepped outside, I pulled the lapels of my coat closer together at the sudden chill in the air. We did a brisk walk home. It was only around 8 p.m., but dark enough that I was worried about Marjorie being by herself. How was I going to cope being on my own after they left? I suddenly realized that as long as Joshua could come and go as he liked, I'd never feel safe. I needed to take action. We arrived home and had a light supper. Dunstan stayed in the living room on the sofa, insisting that I sleep next to Marjorie. I didn't argue, although I did feel guilty he felt the need to stand watch. Perhaps it was the strangeness of having someone else in my bed, or the fact that Marjorie snored like she was sawing wood, but I couldn't fall asleep. I dozed off fitfully, and then I felt suddenly very wide awake. I know that face. I got out of bed carefully, but there was no way Marjorie could have heard me with the racket she was making. I opened the bedroom door, tiptoed past Dunstan, who was also asleep on the sofa, and went into Mrs. Elm's room. I closed the door and flicked on the light switch. I paused. I hadn't been in the room since she died, and it felt a bit like an intrusion. I shook it off. My curiosity had to be satisfied. I went to her bureau and carefully examined the silver-framed photos that chronicled her life events. I paused at the single photo of her wedding. She and James looked very smart. She in a simple white lace dress, holding a bouquet of roses, and he in a suit. I stared at his face. It couldn't be, could it? All the soldiers looked the same to me, with their short-cut hair and trim mustaches, especially in sepia-toned photos. I know that face, I thought again. I picked up the wedding photo and stared at it. I frowned as I concentrated. The photo was not quite set right in the frame. On an impulse, I carefully slid open the time-blackened metal tabs from the underside of the frame and removed the backing. There was another photo behind the wedding picture. I eased it apart, thinking with age the two photos might be stuck together. But to my surprise, they came apart easily. I turned this new photo over. I gasped. It was the photo from Dr. Fineworth's slideshow presentation. It was exactly the same. The photo of the British soldier who had stolen the Tears of Shah with the beautiful Indian nurse. The same smug look on an attractive face. What difference? I stood for a few moments staring at the photograph and trying to piece the puzzle together. How had Dr. Fineworth got a copy of this photograph? Was it really James Elm in the photo? But there was no doubt he was the same man in the wedding photo. Did Mrs. Elm know she had been married to a thief? Worse, an adulterer? It was too much for me to handle on my own. I left the room still clutching the photo and woke Dunstan. He was groggy from sleep, so I quickly made him a cup of tea and we sat together at the kitchen table. Once he was reasonably alert, I showed him the photos. I saw his eyebrows raise, then crash together. "So where are the Tears of Shah?" he asked me after a few minutes of fierce thinking. I blinked. "Well, how the heck would I know? You don't think they're here?" He acted like he was interrogating me, but I realized it was just his policeman habits kicking in. He'd not long retired. "Yes, I do think they're here," he said. "Mrs. Elm never wore jewelry. She had this idea it made a woman look cheap." "I've never seen a jewelry box or anything like that," I said firmly. "She would never be party to a robbery," I added. "He obviously was, but it may be he never brought it out of Libya," Dunstan mused. I was impressed he remembered the details. "And wouldn't he have sold it? He'd have been rich. You can see she lived simply." I gestured to the small kitchen. "Most criminals don't splash their ill gains around to attract attention," he pointed out. I shook my head. "I don't believe this. I must be wrong. This doesn't sound like the man she described. She adored him, Dunstan. Absolutely worshipped him. She was widowed at age 20 and never remarried." "Love is blind," he said, and stared at me meaningfully. I was grateful for my cocoa brown skin which hid my flush. Yes, I too had put the wrong kind of man on a pedestal in my life. "So he comes home, with or without the earrings, stays with her for a few months, goes back to the front, and is killed." I tried to remember the story as Mrs. Elm had told me. Maybe he didn't die. Maybe he and his lover escaped together. Faked his death? Dunstan suggested. I reluctantly agreed this was possible. But from the way Mrs. Elm spoke of him, he had loved her, I was sure. But he had cheated on her, if the robbery story was valid. I felt sad suddenly. Was there no love story that wasn't besmirched with treachery? I was a romantic deep down. They're worth millions of pounds. Gold, diamonds, and sapphires? Might be worth killing over, Dunstan said slowly. We looked at each other. Who would know about it? She surely wouldn't sully his memory by telling anybody that story, I said. Joshua might have found out, Dunstan said. I can't see him keeping a story like that quiet. He's not the type. He wants attention. He would have let something slip. I felt confident about that. I think we're missing the obvious. You should ask your friend, the doctor, where he got the photograph from, and find out if he knows about James Elm, Dunstan said, making perfect sense. We resolved on this plan of action, and Dunstan went back to the sofa. I returned to my room and was asleep in no time, despite Marjorie's snoring symphony. The next morning, over sardines and toast, we planned out the rest of the week. Dunstan and Marjorie had booked a tour of Buckingham Palace and some other spots in London, and would have to catch a taxi into the city to meet up with their tour group. We should cancel, Marjorie said, looking worried. Oh, no. I'm sure that joker won't come back now he thinks there's people here, I reassured. I somewhat believe this. Joshua was a complete coward, but he seemed to have enlisted help. I told myself I wasn't worried. Dunstan was silent but made no contribution to the conversation. Eventually, I convinced Marjorie she shouldn't waste good money by cancelling their tour, and they both left me to go pack an overnight bag. I called Dr. Fineworth's office and tried to book an appointment, but was told he was solidly booked for at least 2 weeks. I chewed my bottom lip for a brief minute, and then asked if perhaps he could call me instead. His receptionist promised to relay the message, and I decided I should probably give the place a cleaning while I waited. I went into Joshua's room first, opened the windows, and hoped the stale cigarette smell would leave. It was as I expected: dirty linens, cigarette butts in ashtrays under the bed, an undergarment that belonged to Giselle, I hoped, that I swept up with the dust. But otherwise nothing of note. I changed the linens and dusted. I opened the oak wardrobe and saw he'd left some shirts and a denim jacket behind, and a pair of shoes at the bottom. Next to the shoes was a tea saucer. I picked it up. There were fine white dust particles in the recessed center of the saucer where the cup would fit. I rolled some of the particles between my fingers. They were rough, hard little pellets. I had a sudden flashback to the first night I arrived. I had washed out a teacup from Mrs. Elm's room, and there had been these types of grounds in it. I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Father in heaven. I was frozen for a moment as terrible thoughts ran amok through my mind. I heard Dunstan moving around in the living room, and I resisted the urge to take my find to him. It would just worry them more and force them to change their plans. I remembered that I had put the first set of grounds I found in a napkin. It was still on the bureau in my room. I'd have to wait until they left to retrieve it. I blew out a breath, composed my expression, and walked into the living room carrying a broom in one hand and the saucer in the other. Dunstan was putting on his coat and had his back to me, so I continued on into the kitchen. I grabbed a napkin and carefully dusted the particles into it, and then put that napkin into a small plastic bag. I wrote the date on the bag in marker. "The taxi is here," Marjorie called, and I went to see them off. "Call us if anything. Here's the tour company number," she said, handing me a business card. I promised to do just that. They left, and I closed and bolted the door behind them. I quickly went into my room and retrieved the other napkin I had tucked into an old candle holder. I put both sets of grounds in my handbag, and on an impulse, I also put in the photo of James Elm. I made short work of getting dressed and headed down to the village to the local pharmacy. The pharmacist gave me a strange look over his bifocals when I asked him to have the particles tested, but he said he'd have a look. It would take a few hours, and I intended to put the time to good use. Fortunately, Dr. Fineworth's clinic was adjacent to the pharmacy, so I decided to try my luck. As I opened the clinic door, the little bell overhead sounded, and everyone turned to look at me. There were several women with children present and about 4 elderly patients. The small room was indeed full. No one said good morning, and the adults looked off. The children stared at me openly. Dr. Fineworth came out at that moment to talk to his receptionist, and his face registered surprise, and then concern, as he saw me. He gave her some instructions, then beckoned me over to the counter. "Everything okay?" he asked, and I nodded, suddenly feeling foolish for imposing on his precious time. "May I talk to you for a moment?" I asked. "Of course. I heard about the intruders at your place a few days ago. Why didn't you tell me?" he said as he directed me into his office. He went around me to sit at his desk. He had several files open and seemed to be working on them simultaneously. I didn't sit, but instead dug into my handbag and pulled out the photo of James Elm. I showed it to him, and he took it from me. He glanced at me with an unreadable expression. "This is James Elm. You had his photo in your slideshow last night. How did you have a copy of this?" I demanded. He held my gaze before answering. "This is the copy. I have the original. I'm the one who gave this to Mrs. Elm," he said. He smiled at my obvious surprise. "So, I mean, he really did that theft you talked about?" I was so flustered by his matter-of-fact response, I wasn't even sure what I was saying. "Yes, he did. I became very interested in this story as a boy when I lived in India, and it became a pet obsession. I couldn't believe my luck when I moved here and realized I had found his home village," Dr. Fineworth smiled. My grandmother had an odd saying, "Fool me do." As I listened, I could hear her words clear as day in my head. Luck? Nobody had that kind of luck. "You showed this photo to Mrs. Elm. What did she say?" I asked. "She was shocked, of course. She couldn't understand how I had come across it, and when I explained it had turned up in old reports from the robbery, well, I'm afraid I let my eagerness for the truth get the better of me." He looked rueful, and I could see he was embarrassed. "She must have been very upset," I said. Idiot. He was a doctor. Didn't he realize what a shock like that would do to an old woman with a bad heart? "So you think she had the jewels?" I said, eyeing him coldly. "And if the police or whoever knew he was the thief, why didn't they arrest him?" "Because it was a scandal for the family who owned the Tears of Shah, and because the authorities of the day had something called World War I to occupy their efforts. By the time they put two and two together, Elm had been killed at the front," he explained. Then he frowned. "No, I don't think she had the jewels. It was obvious she had never even heard of them. She flatly refused to believe me. I didn't see her again after that," he said. He seemed regretful. I remembered Giselle mentioned getting sedatives from the pharmacy. Must have been over the counter. "Did Giselle ever check with you about Mrs. Elm's medications? About sedatives and possible interaction with her heart medication?" I walked over to the door and put my hand on the doorknob as I spoke. Dr. Fineworth stood up and came toward me. His brow was slightly creased. "She certainly didn't. Do you suspect her?" He covered my hand on the knob, and I was momentarily distracted by the warmth. "She had no idea what she was doing, and she gave Mrs. Elm some random sleeping pills. I'll know for sure soon," I said. He pursed his lips and nodded. His hand lingered on mine. "As your friend, Hope, believe me, if you don't get out of this village, you're going to end up like June Elm did, alone with nothing but memories for company," he said earnestly. His words struck to the heart of my secret fears, and I felt my eyes burn. "She still had me, even to the end," I replied. I turned the knob. He smiled, but there was deep sadness in it. He lifted his hand and I opened the door and left. I went home and finished some light sweeping and laundry, then called the pharmacy about a half hour before it was due to close. The pharmacist's assistant, an impatient younger man, told me I'd have to wait for more conclusive results. "Can't you just tell me if they're prescription or over-the-counter?" I asked. "I already know they're sleeping pills." "No, they aren't," he said abruptly. "What?" "They're not sedatives. It's some kind of supplement. We think it's ginseng," he said, and actually hung up on me. I stared at the receiver and considered calling back to give him a piece of my mind. I hung the receiver up. I made a cup of tea and sat staring into its almond-brown depths. I'd been wrong. No, I was deliberately misled. Giselle herself had said she was giving Mrs. Elm sleeping pills. Why? Just to get under my skin? I sipped the tea. The flavors of brown sugar and the tang of the strong tea leaves mingled on my tongue. It illuminated the matter clearly. That's it? But could she have known? I realized my own prejudice had blinded me. I thought because Giselle was vulgar, she was unintelligent. The phone rang before I could process this further. Marjorie was on the other end, complaining that Dunstan was insisting on visiting the Tower of London, and she wanted to go shopping. I cut her short to ask to speak to him. Hello? His baritone voice was solid and comforting. I think I know how she did it. Giselle, I mean. I think I know how she killed Mrs. Elm. I spoke quickly. I could picture his bushy eyebrows crashing together. She was giving her ginseng, and Mrs. Elm was on heart pills and blood pressure pills. Ginseng can interact with those medicines and prompt heart arrhythmia. I tried to remember what I'd been taught during training as a nursing home aide. So you mean Giselle caused Mrs. Elm to have a heart attack? He asked. I heard the doubt. Something like that. I don't exactly remember what it does, but we were warned you have to get a doctor's okay for some supplements, and Giselle didn't check with Dr. Fineworth. Dunstan was silent, and then he sighed heavily. You have to tell the police, but it's going to be hard to prove. Your word against her. There's not even a body to autopsy, he pointed out. I bet it was her idea too, I realized with frustration. We talked a few more minutes, and he promised we'd come up with a plan when they returned the next evening. I realized the long night now lay ahead of me. I just have to lock up well and keep a knife handy. I'll be fine, I told myself.